There are some deaths that arrive, are grieved, and slowly fade into history. And then there are deaths that never quite settle, where the questions keep circling back no matter how many official reports try to close the book. Princess Diana's death in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris, in the early hours of August 31st, 1997, belongs firmly to the second category. Nearly 3 decades later, people are still typing her name into search bars next to words like cover-up, conspiracy, and truth. This isn't a story about a secret confession that rewrites everything we know. No police chief has come forward with a shocking new admission. What actually happened is in some ways more interesting than that: a decade-long multi-million-pound British inquest, a French judicial investigation, thousands of pages of testimony, and a jury verdict that still didn't fully satisfy everyone who was watching. This is the story of that process, the real evidence, the real theories that were raised, and the real conclusion a jury reached, along with the doubts that persisted anyway. When news broke that Diana had died, the reaction was immediate and enormous. Crowds gathered outside Kensington Palace and Buckingham Palace within hours. Flowers piled up faster than staff could clear them. Her funeral, days later, was watched by an estimated global audience in the hundreds of millions, one of the most watched broadcasts in television history. For a lot of people, it didn't feel like the death of a distant royal figure. It felt personal. Diana had spent years cultivating exactly that kind of connection, visiting hospitals, sitting with AIDS patients when much of the public was still afraid to touch them, campaigning against landmines. She'd built an image as someone who broke from royal formality, and that image made her death land differently than it might have for any other member of the family. That emotional intensity is part of why the story never really closed. When something jars that badly against people's sense of how the world is supposed to work, there's a natural pull toward looking for a bigger, more coherent explanation than a driver went too fast in a tunnel. Grief looks for causes. And in this case, there were just enough odd details: a mangled second car that fled the scene, a security officer with intelligence world connections, conflicting statements from officials, to give that search for meaning somewhere to go. The first formal investigation happened in France, since the crash occurred on French soil. It was led by Judge Hervé Stephan, and its conclusion, delivered in 1999, was straightforward. The crash was caused by driver error. Henri, the Ritz Hotel's acting head of security, who was behind the wheel that night, was found to have been driving well over the French legal blood alcohol limit, and have been driving at high speed while being pursued by photographers on motorcycles and in cars. The French inquiry did not find evidence of a deliberate plot. That might have been the end of it, but in Britain, both because Diana was British and because of intense public pressure, a separate legal process eventually got underway. It didn't happen quickly. The first coroner assigned to the case died before the inquest could begin. It then passed to Michael Burgess, who handed primary responsibility to Lord Stevens, the former head of London's Metropolitan Police, to conduct a fresh investigation known as Operation Paget. Stevens's team re-examined the physical evidence, re-interviewed witnesses, and in 2006 published a report that, like the French inquiry before it, found no evidence of murder or conspiracy, concluding the deaths were the result of the crash itself, caused by excessive speed and Henri Paul's impairment. Even after that report, the case didn't move to a quick close. Baroness Butler-Sloss took over as coroner, but stepped aside after a court ruling required the inquest to proceed with a jury, a process she felt she wasn't suited to lead. It finally fell to Lord Justice Scott Baker, who opened the formal inquest in 2007. Around 80 potential jurors were screened for any personal or professional ties to the royal family, the Al Fayed family, or British intelligence services, before a jury of 11 was impaneled. The inquest that followed ran for roughly 6 months, making it one of the longest and most expensive in British legal history. It's worth being precise about what a British inquest jury's job actually is, because it's often misunderstood. An inquest doesn't put anyone on trial. It doesn't hand down a criminal conviction. Its purpose is to establish who died and how, when, and where relevant, to reach a formal conclusion about the medical cause and the circumstances of death. Over the course of the hearings, the jury heard testimony that touched on more than 100 witnesses, ranging from hotel staff and paparazzi to medical responders and forensic experts. They reviewed CCTV footage from inside the Ritz Hotel showing Diana and Dodi Fayed in the hours before the crash, footage that had never been made public before the inquest. They examined Henri Paul's movements that evening, including an unexplained gap of roughly 3 hours, during which his whereabouts weren't fully accounted for. They looked closely at blood alcohol evidence that put his level at roughly 3 times the French legal limit, and heard arguments from some quarters questioning whether the samples had been correctly handled, though ultimately the toxicology findings held up under scrutiny. They considered the decoy car plan hastily arranged at the Ritz that night, intended to throw off the photographers waiting outside, and how that plan may have contributed to a faster, more chaotic departure than would otherwise have happened. They also had to weigh the more emotionally charged, harder-to-verify claims, most forcefully advanced by Mohammed Al-Fayed, Dodi's father, who maintained publicly and repeatedly that the deaths were the result of a deliberate plot, potentially connected to elements of the British establishment uncomfortable with the idea of Diana marrying a Muslim man. Al-Fayed's claims were extensively investigated by both the French and Stevens's Operation Paget inquiries, and both concluded there was no credible evidence to support them. That didn't stop him from continuing to assert it for years afterward, and his conviction became one of the most persistent threads keeping public suspicion alive, independent of what the physical evidence actually showed. One detail that has fueled speculation more than almost any other is the mystery of the white Fiat Uno. Fragments of a broken taillight and traces of white paint were found at the scene and on the crashed Mercedes, suggesting some kind of contact with another vehicle in the moments before the crash. A car matching that description was reportedly seen in the vicinity that night and was never definitively located or its driver identified with full certainty afterward, though investigators did trace and interview a photographer, James Anson, who owned a white Fiat Uno, before ruling him out as being in Paris that night based on his own account and available evidence. Anson died in 2000 in circumstances that were themselves investigated and ruled a suicide, which, for those already inclined toward suspicion, only added another loose thread to pull on. The presence of a second vehicle doesn't, on its own, prove a conspiracy. Cars brush against each other in traffic incidents all the time without any intent involved, and a genuinely unrelated Fiat could plausibly have clipped the Mercedes, and its driver fled simply out of panic or to avoid legal trouble, with no connection to the broader tragedy at all. But because the vehicle and its owner were never conclusively tied together with certainty, it became one of the few genuinely unresolved physical details in an otherwise fairly well-documented sequence of events. And unresolved details are exactly the kind of thing conspiracy theories are built around. Henri Paul's role drew intense scrutiny throughout the inquest, partly because of his job, and partly because of who he reported to and associated with. As deputy head of security at the Ritz, part of his role involved routine contact with French security services, a fairly ordinary arrangement for someone in his position at a hotel that regularly hosted high-profile guests. Some press coverage in the years after the crash suggested this made him more than just hotel staff, floating the idea that he might have had a closer relationship with intelligence agencies than his official role implied. Operation Paget examined British intelligence files as part of its investigation and reported finding no evidence linking Paul or the crash itself to any intelligence operation, British or French. What the inquest did establish clearly was that Paul had been drinking that evening, that his blood alcohol level was well over the legal limit, and that footage of him in the hotel lobby beforehand, walking steadily, at one point bending down to tie his shoes, created a visible contrast with the toxicology results that some jurors and observers found hard to immediately reconcile. Medical experts testified about how functional appearance and actual impairment can diverge, particularly in an experienced, regular drinker, which helped explain that apparent contradiction without requiring any conspiracy to account for it. One of the more genuinely uncomfortable parts of the inquest, for British audiences especially, involved the medical response after the crash. French emergency medicine protocol at the time emphasized stabilizing a patient at the scene and during transport rather than rushing them to the nearest hospital, which is a different approach from the scoop and run model more common in the UK and US. Diana was treated inside the wrecked car for a significant period, then transported at a measured pace to the Pity-Salpêtrière hospital, a trip that in total took close to 2 hours from the time of the crash to arrival. The inquest heard detailed medical testimony on this point, and ultimately the jury did not find that the medical response amounted to negligence contributing to her death. French doctors defended the approach as standard practice for the type of internal injuries she had sustained. But the sheer length of that gap and the very different assumptions about emergency care in the two countries remained one of the more emotionally difficult elements of the whole account, and it's a detail that continues to surface in retrospective coverage even now. After 6 months of testimony, the jury returned its conclusion in April 2008. It found that Diana and Dodi Fayed had been unlawfully killed and attributed that unlawful killing to the grossly negligent driving of both Henri Paul and the vehicles pursuing the Mercedes, meaning the paparazzi chasing the car were named alongside Paul as contributing to the crash through their driving. The jury explicitly rejected the idea that the crash was the result of a conspiracy or a deliberate act by any individual or organization. That verdict lined up with what both the French investigation and Operation Paget had already concluded years earlier. 3 separate inquiries, conducted in 2 countries by different investigators using different methods, arrived at essentially the same account: excessive speed, alcohol impairment, and a dangerous, high-speed pursuit through central Paris, rather than any orchestrated plot. Given 3 converging investigations, it might seem like the matter should have been settled definitively. In practice, it wasn't, at least not in the public imagination. Part of that comes down to Mohammed Al-Fayed's sustained public campaign, which kept alternative explanations circulating in the media for years after the official findings were published. Part of it comes down to the handful of details that were never fully resolved, like the exact ownership and whereabouts of the Fiat Uno driver at the moment of contact. And part of it is simply about how people process a death that felt, to millions of them, disproportionately significant relative to a fairly mundane and tragically common cause: a drunk, speeding driver being chased by photographers on a bad stretch of road. There's also a broader pattern worth naming. High-profile, sudden deaths of beloved public figures tend to generate conspiracy theories almost as a matter of course, regardless of how thoroughly they're investigated. It happened with John F. Kennedy, with Marilyn Monroe, with plenty of others. The sheer scale of public grief seems to create pressure for an explanation that feels proportionate to the loss, and a series of ordinary, preventable human failures rarely feels like it meets that bar, even when the evidence consistently points there. Setting aside the speculation, what the record actually shows is this: Diana had, in the weeks and months before her death, expressed some private concern about her safety and had asked her lawyer about increasing security around her car, a detail that surfaced during the inquest and that some have pointed to as evidence she sensed danger. Whether that reflected a specific, founded fear or a more general unease common to someone living under constant, intense media pursuit is something the inquest could not conclusively determine either way. What's clear is that the final hours of her life were marked by an attempt, however improvised, to escape the photographers who had followed her for years, a decoy plan hatched at the last minute by hotel staff and security, a driver who should not have been behind the wheel, and a high-speed chase through central Paris that ended in one of the most scrutinized car crashes in modern history. 3 formal investigations, hundreds of witnesses, and years of legal process converged on an explanation that is tragic largely because of how preventable it was, not because of any hidden hand behind it. That doesn't mean every question has a tidy answer. The Fiat Uno was never definitively resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Henri Paul's missing hours were never fully accounted for. And for people who lost someone who felt, in some strange parasocial way, like family, grossly negligent driving was never going to feel like a complete enough explanation for a loss that large. That gap between what the evidence supports and what the scale of the grief seems to demand is, in the end, probably the real reason this story has never stopped being told. What do you think about the events leading up to the crash? Are there details you think deserve more scrutiny, even within the official record? Let us know in the comments. If you found this rundown useful, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the stories behind the headlines.